Okay, so we are here for our first stream of May I Ask a Question Season 3. For anybody who doesn't know what the stream is, it is us, myself and Jen Weber, uh, answering questions on Stack Overflow that are based on Ember. So anybody who's asking Ember questions on Stack Overflow might be featured. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Jen Weber. I'm on the Ember Learning team. I love writing and front end app development and working on UX problems. I'm excited to work on answering some Stack Overflow questions because one thing that's really important to me is making it easier for more people to get involved in web development. And if someone's building a web app for the first time, chances are they're probably going to end up Googling something, and those search results are probably going to have something from Stack Overflow. So this is kind of a nice way to help some beginners as well as more experienced Ember users out.
And I am Chris Manson. I'm also on the learning team. I tend to focus on like tooling stuff or anything that's kind of making the job of any documentation writer a tiny bit easier. I've also been focusing a lot on the Ember website, which, if I remember correctly, wasn't released last year. So since last season of May I Ask a Question, the new Ember website is live and all fancy looking. And there's lots of work from lots of people, including Jen, who are trying to update all of the different apps that we're working on. And I kind of have the same goal as what you just said there. I like to improve the situation for people who are Googling general app development stuff. And I like to think that the work on the website is going to help Ember show up in a few of those search results and people get the right information instead of out-of-date information. Cool. So shall we get started?
Yep, let's talk about this question here.
Okay, so which one is this? Okay, so UI automation. Elements in my
Also,
UI have Ember ideas. Oh, do you want to say
reminder
something?
to zoom in because,
Oh, yeah, exactly.
yep,
Because this is micro
it's going to
micro
be
on
tough to
people's
read.
screens.
Lovely, thank you.
Cool. So this is somebody who is trying to do some UI automation and kind of hooking into Ember IDs, which are changing frequently in their application. So how do I use the ID for automation? So they have an example here of what looks like, yeah, this is definitely a output of an Ember application because you've got your comments in there, you've got Ember View, all this stuff in here. Ember View? And they're trying to do an XPath CSS selector to get this. What did they say it was? It was a drop down.
Mm-hmm.
So I am using the ID to locate the element, but every time it changes, I need to modify the code. Is there any other attribute I could use for Ember.js UI elements? So, do you want to talk about this first, or shall I jump in?
Yeah, so I think it's worth considering down in the comments real quick.
Mm-hmm.
The context. Is this the Selenium one? No. Yes, this is
I
the
work with a
Selenium
framework
one.
built on Selenium. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they had a few questions about how, how working with Selenium would um, perhaps impact their experience and ability to target different elements within the DOM. So I think we can kind of break this question up into a few different parts here. So firstly, um, they're working with, it looks like if you go back up to the code there that they shared, is that Ember Basic Dropdown? Ember Basic Dropdown is an add-on, correct? Is
That's
it?
correct.
Okay, so
Yeah.
the first thing is this question of how do you test an add-on or like interact with an add-on within your tests? So in this case, perhaps they're trying to target something that's actually um, rendered by this add-on. That's one thing. Second thing is, how does something like Selenium fit into the problem space? So Selenium being kind of like a browser automation tool. It's kind of in Ember world, we don't have to work with Selenium too much because a lot of Ember apps just use the built-in Ember tools, like, it comes with QUnit and test runners out of the box. But, there's a number of reasons why someone might customize that. So there's a question of how does Selenium affect things? And then there's a question of like, what are some useful things that you can put in your app code that make it easy and maintainable to find these elements? So I think those are sort of the three problem spaces. Where do you think we should begin?
So I think the best place to begin is that last point that you made, this stuff that you can add to your application to make this just a tiny bit easier. Because this is down to, it's also kind of related to the second thing you said, where it's like we don't tend to need to worry about this too much in the Ember community because we tend to use the built-in tools. So it's kind of the I think it's even suggested down here. So this idea of Ember test selectors is kind of, it's pretty standard. It's like idiomatic Ember. It's like most Ember developers tend to work this way nowadays. So if we start with that as an example, then that might be a good place. And also something I noticed when you were saying, is this an add-on? This is actually Ember Power Select as well. So Ember Power Select uses Ember Basic Dropdown, and that's that much I know. So what I can do here, let's see if I can make this a bit bigger.
I'm also thinking a fourth aspect to this is that we're also looking at classic components present in this add-on, whatever version of the add-on that they're working with, because it looks like there are like a lot of those wrappers and IDs and things come from classic Ember.
Yeah.
So the new style components, if you do import Ember from @glimmer/component, those Glimmer components, so to speak, do not have an auto-generated wrapping element. Whereas an Ember classic component, the one that has been used for years and years, whenever you make a component, it automatically has a container around it that's assigned an ID. And so if someone is working with a more recent version of Ember, they might not see these IDs at all in the components if they're looking at the rendered DOM for their component.
Yeah, it's an interesting question actually, because if this is provided by an add-on, it's like, is this has the add-on updated to the newer way or not yet? So it's kind of, we're in this transition period where if add-ons would like to support a lot of previous versions of Ember, they can't quite update yet, so they have to still support the classic implementation, which is fine. It's this is the whole point of Ember Octane. It's not a breaking change. It's not a line in the sand that you cannot cross. It's something that actually, it's okay to use the old ways, but like you say, you might see slightly older techniques for a little while.
Yep.
Excuse
so
me.
while you're waiting for that to load, I think maybe we could talk for a moment about different approaches to finding elements within code, whether you're using Ember's built-in tools or you're using something like Selenium. So in my experience, when I first started web development, I actually would use, I knew you weren't supposed, I was a beginner. I knew you were not supposed to use IDs for styling for the most part, that you should use classes when you wanted to write a CSS rule. And so I was using the IDs of my elements I would write my own, and I would use the IDs in my tests. That caused problems sometimes because if you have two elements with the same ID in your HTML, it can break your web page in strange and unexpected ways. The browser expects that each ID on an element is unique. So I would get into this situation where I wrote all these tests based on IDs, and then I would be like, ooh, I want to reuse this component. I want to iterate over it and make a whole bunch of them rendered on the same page. Then I had to go back and change all my tests and change all my IDs, and it was a big problem. So from that point on, if we're just talking about regular HTML, we're not even talking about Ember. There's a few different options. You could use a class name for a while. I did like test dash something, and I would use those class names in my test. So I could say find test dash my dropdown, and I'd be able to get them. That was one option. Another option is to use the data attributes. These are present in regular HTML, where you could do data dash test dash my dropdown and select those using regular native, document selectors or jQuery or your own test library, whatever you prefer. And then there's add-ons like Ember Test Helpers, which Chris will show us here, that give you a little bit of extra features on top of that native HTML behavior of being able to use data test. Actually, one more strategy, sorry, real quick, that I've seen used. So in my work right now, my colleagues actually they have a test helper that looks for text in the DOM, and they do their selects by the text itself. They don't have any visual integration testing, and so it's kind of a way for them to make sure that the user-facing content that they want to display is actually rendered, which is an interesting approach. It means that if you change copy somewhere, you have to change a bunch of tests, though, and so whether or not to do that really depends on the kind of app that you're building and what your goals as a team are for testing. So, you were saying, Chris.
So, what I was just trying to figure out this thing. This.names options. I'm just trying to follow the documentation for this. Selected. Yes. So essentially what I'm doing right now, just to bring people up to speed, is I'm just following the kind of quick start documentation for Ember Simple, Ember, what's it called? Ember Power Select. I can't quite get it to work. Do you see what I'm doing wrong? So we're passing selected in as this.name. We're doing onChange as this.changed. Options. The options is working fine. I've got an action that gets something changed name. Let's make sure it's that. We're doing this dot that's why. Attract name. Boom. And that is tracked. Is it object? Where does tracking come from? Oh, you're muted. I can't hear you.
It comes from @glimmer/tracking.
So that's
you also, if you want your whenever you're working with tracked arrays, you're setting name. You've got name
just for the name.
Okay. Never mind. I guess I'll still say for the stream though, if you're working with tracked and you're trying to use it with arrays, it's a good idea to look at the documentation because you can't just do like array.push in that case because tracked can't, there's no way for tracked to know that something has changed when you're modifying objects and arrays and things in that way. So read the docs, it can be done. It's just maybe not the first thing that someone would try. So, all right, how's it going now? Is that better?
So it's now working, and now I think is the best time for us to start uh, testing some of the things that you said. So the first example that you said was that actually what we'd love to do is we'd love to like forget about Ember for a second because we're talking about Selenium. We're talking about something that just interacts with the HTML. So we'd love to get this element, and we've got an ID in here somewhere, don't we?
Yep.
Where's the ID? I can't see it.
Oh, I'm looking at data. Sorry, I was looking at data ID. Can you zoom in?
Oh, I can zoom in on this thing as well.
Yeah, thanks.
I think I can move it this way.
Div.
There's an
So,
EBD ID, but no other ID. That's odd. Is this new?
we can look to see what version. Well, there's Ember Basic drop-down content there, dash Ember 1A3. If you look down to the next
Oh,
there,
this one here.
you can see an example of something with an ID. There you go.
Yeah. Oh, it has an ID. It's interesting because the first thing that I've noticed then is that this does look different to the version that the person in the question is actually showing.
Yep.
So,
I think we can still. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, I was just saying that it's like it might be worth them kind of checking what version they are, and it's kind of always a general good idea for questions like this. It's like, say what version of Ember you're using, say what version of Ember's God, I can never remember it. Ember Power Select you're using, so that if people like us are coming in and going, oh, let's help you out, we know exactly the context of this. So let's go in here. So let's say the thing that we're looking for is in here. We want to find out which actual thing has been selected. So really, I don't know. I don't know if people can see this actually because of the. Yeah, I'll move it into the middle. So there's a little trick if you ever want to test like either XPath or CSS selector stuff in the browser. If you've got this elements thing open, you can just do Control F or Command F, and it brings up this little string selector or XPath thing, which is pretty cool. And what we want to do is let's imagine for now that this is our ID. So it's actually data ebd.id or something. Or is there an ID here? There isn't. So if we wanted to find it based on this thing, we could do data ebd id equals Ember 183 trigger. Boom. And you'll see that the div that we're talking about, this actual drop down, has been selected, and actually it's not the thing we care about. We care about is the span inside it. And then if this was Selenium, we'd do like inner text or whatever the way to do that in Selenium is. But I think the point here is that if we change this, oh no, it hasn't changed. Or if we refresh the browser, let's say, there's a chance. So the point I was going to make there was that if you look here, now we've refreshed the page, it's no longer actually showing the same thing. Oh, it has. It's actually got the same ID. So I think how do we make it have a different ID? Do you need to use another component or something?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, they used to change in earlier Ember. The IDs would change out from underneath constantly. I think.
Let's try generate a Ember G component face. Let's try and just throw in a face component.
Sure.
And see what happens.
Face. So I think. Let's see what happens here.
Oh, it's still got the same ID. That's really interesting.
Is your
The
face component in there?
it will be, but it's empty. So
Oh, okay.
I just didn't throw
Yep.
anything in there. H1 face. Oh, I do like to use face as a
And
as an
then,
example.
will it still have a wrapping? I think you need the JavaScript class there in order to have the wrapping elements, right?
Even the class won't give it a wrapping element if it's a Glimmer class.
But yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you generate a classic component, then
Ah,
you would force having a if you have a JavaScript file that is referencing at ember/component, you should get um, that
a new
wrapping
ID.
element. Yeah,
Interesting.
I think
I don't know
so.
how to generate a new one. Can you
It's
collocate?
it's it should be, yeah, you could do that. Then you got to type a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it's fine.
I would do Ember G component dash CC for classic component, and then a component name would get you this
Okay,
file.
let's try that. I don't know how to. I've never done that before. Ember G component dash CC
Hmm.
face. I've never generated a classic component before. Oh, somebody's
And then
saying
say no. You don't want to overwrite.
Ember G
This is the
component face. Yes, you are right that I should be watching the chat. Okay, here we go. Ah, I need to close it because I had it open already. Wow. So things I learned. You can generate a classic component and co-location of classic components works. Fun
yeah, it sure
stuff.
does.
Okay.
So if anyone is new to Ember, watching this recording later, or watching today, what we're referring to here is that there's two different styles of components that you can use in Ember. There's classic components and what people refer to as Glimmer components. You can tell which one you're using by looking at the JavaScript file that's associated with the component. That's the easiest place, and just look at where it imports from. And within the past year, there were some changes about which type of component was generated by default. So for us, we're in a brand new 3.18 app. We're getting the Glimmer components, and if we want, we can use the classic style. We just kind of have to opt in when we run those commands.
So I hadn't even thought about this. We released Octane since our last season of May I Ask a Question? Like that's
Yep.
huge. It's like you could almost be thinking about this as a different framework. It's so new and fancy and magical.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, we have a question in the chat. Is there any reason we're to keep using the old style component over the Glimmer components? So, the first reason I would say is if you already have a bunch of components, you don't need to update them right away. The second reason is that right now, what we were trying to do was we were trying to bump this Ember ID thing. Actually, it's not even a real ID, but that's probably why we were trying to get it. It wasn't working. But it turns out that Glimmer components don't bump that ID. It's just classic components. So that's why we wanted it in this case. So I guess the answer to the question is probably for legacy reasons. What do you think, Jen?
So for me, I'm trying to think of the one thing that you just cannot do with a Glimmer component out of the box is positional parameters.
Oh, it looks like
So
No Vox Populi in the chat also said that. So
yeah,
snap.
I can't. I'm like only on one screen. I keep flipping back. So yeah, positional params, which is where you say like my component, and then pass the arguments is literally just like apples, bananas. Whereas normally you would say fruit one equals apples, fruit two equals bananas, or whatever, something along those lines. You would
So
give each of
face.
your parameters a name. Positional parameters are like kind of tricky and annoying, but yes, exactly. Novel accessing does not recommend. Yeah, I don't recommend them either, just
So
for like.
they don't even work with angle brackets. Am I right? You can't do
Yeah, I don't think
this.
they do.
Like that
Um,
doesn't even mean anything. Bad,
so
bad.
yeah, for positional params, the other reason to use classic components is if you're working in an app where, you and your team haven't yet uh, tackled up, starting to write Glimmer components. It's a really good idea to coordinate with your team, meet and together figure out a plan for learning. I picked up Glimmer components pretty quickly, but if I had just stumbled upon them in an app that I was working on without any context, and I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to read every single Ember newsletter kind of person, I wouldn't expect people to read every Ember newsletter. I would expect that plenty of people don't know what Octane is. That would be like kind of a nasty surprise. So in
Mm,
those cases, I would continue to use classic components until I've had the chance to meet with my teammates and figure out what we want to do in terms of
yeah.
taking advantage of Glimmer components. The advantages of Glimmer components is even though they're not may not be familiar to people, there is a learning curve, of course. Um, Overall, the API of them is much simpler, and so your existing team might have a little bit of confusion on the learning curve, but when you bring new people in, um, my instincts are that they will have a much easier time with Glimmer components than with Classic
Yeah.
because it's if they know how to write an Ember object, they know like 95% of the things that they need to know about the
Yeah.
component.
It's interesting. My experience on that has been similar. In with a client at the moment, we have a bunch of people who have been hired that have experience in the wider JavaScript ecosystem, but not necessarily in Ember. So
Hmm.
they come into it, and if they come across some of the older things, they're like, "What even is this?" But when they start using Glimmer components, it's like, "Oh, this makes sense,"
Yeah, yeah.
which is
But
exactly what we
the
wanted.
backwards compatibility is huge. And if you're an Ember, the other situation is if you're an add-on author, you should use classic components if you want to keep a wide net of support. I've seen
Yes.
some add-on authors update to start using Glimmer components, and that's cool and it helps for maintaining those add-ons and making them pretty, but it also means that they're leaving people behind um, who maybe aren't able to update
Which
um,
is fine as long as you communicate it and you do a major version and all this sort of stuff. Like, but yeah, it's something if you
yeah.
want to
And I
support
would
older
still
ones.
like, if it's an internal add-on for your company or whatever, or your own hobby project, like do whatever, use Glimmer components. But for big, like well-used, stable add-ons, it's worth a serious consideration to stay with classic components in order to maintain backwards compatibility for an extended time. Classic components are not deprecated; they're still part of the Ember framework. So, yeah, still good to. They're still fine to use, and so it helps more people use your add-on. Anyway,
Okay,
that's what I
so
have to
let's
say.
jump into the next example here. So we've finally, with a little bit of coaxing, recreated the bug where the ID has changed. So the second example that you gave was using a class. So I think if you pass a class into PowerSelect, it'll do what you expect. So what is this? This is going to be our name selector. So if I do that, please, hopefully we'll get a name selector class um, in the elements. Do we get a class? Class equals.
Nope,
Oh, nope. So
didn't get it.
I wonder if this is a read the documentation where we would say styles, where we'd maybe have to pass it in as an at class or something like that. But uh, as we don't have time to read the documentation, I'm going to try this.
um, It's really funny. I just imagine myself like saying like at work, "Oh, I don't have time to read the documentation." Um, I also want to point out here that this person's using Selenium. Who has the person who has this question? They're using Selenium, so they can't use special Ember test helpers. But if you are using test a tool like PowerSelect, you can take a look at the docs to see if it provides helpers. Power Select, Ember Basic Dropdown, etc. They have test helpers in the box that help you trigger this element and
Hmm.
select things from it. And so if you're sticking to the Ember testing basics, you can shortcut all this stuff and use what's been provided from the add-on.
So in this case, test helpers, they have this thing
Yep.
here where they register the power select helpers, blah, blah, blah. And then you can choose based on. See, they're using a class. City selector. What am I doing wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Do they have an
That's
example
wondering.
of using class? Basic customization. Disabled. Do they have search in here? No, they don't. Clear button. List. There must be a way to pass a class. Does anybody in the chat know how to do this?
I'm amused because the chat is discussing your headphones.
Oh,
A hug for your ears. Um,
oh, they're great. They're absolutely great. So it's implying that you can use classes.
hmm. Can I see your code again?
So I did class equals my fancy class.
Okay. And
And it's power select.
did your data test selector show up?
So neither of them showed up.
Oh, very interesting. Well,
My fancy class isn't there.
perhaps there's been a change. That's one option, and the docs need to be updated. Your next option is like I would just probably not debug this and skip straight to wrapping. I'm gonna wrap the element myself. Make a div. Uh,
Yeah, and this is kind of a really good example of something where if you are having a struggle or something like this, you can fall back on your normal web development skills to actually implement it.
yep.
So your example there is to do div class equals really this must work, uh, and then that means that actually div we will be able to for sure
And
select it in
we
some
throw the
way.
data test selectors in there too, just so we can see them in the. Yeah, there it is.
So this
Uh,
one suggestion from the chat was use the named argument class, which I tried, but it still hasn't put in my fancy class,
yeah.
which
If
is
you could throw the
interesting.
data test selectors in there, and we can have a
Oh,
look at
in
it.
here as well.
Because
Test.
I'm getting to the end of the time that I can be here. So this data test stuff will the data attribute is part of regular HTML. So you can throw it on and it will show up. You don't have to install Ember test selectors in order to take advantage of this. But if you don't have Ember test selectors, this data test attribute will stay in your code when you do a build for production. And so your DOM elements will be littered with data test things that the users would be able to see if they open up the dev tools. Um, Ember test selectors does does a step during the app build process that takes out anything that starts with data test. That's so great because it means that the DOM looks nice and clean when you are serving your app in production. It means there's less, fewer characters to load across the internet. It means you're not leaking some of your internals. Um, it's pretty cool. And you don't have to do anything. Just kind of, you follow the README and you get to opt into that behavior with once you've installed Ember test selectors.
So one thing that I quite like of it as well is that actually I like the way that you select it. So this is a class selector, and then putting this in here, data test checking. I just think it looks great. This whole in brackets, that's what I'm checking for.
Ooh, do you want to show? Oh, do you want to show a quick example of like setting the data test attribute to something? I think that's a really cool.
The other thing you can do as here is do this dot name, I think. So actually, I've set it now so that this is interesting. So I've set it to something that is currently null. The name is null. When I select something, data test checking equals Tomster, which means that you can now actually pick that Tomster like this. So you can actually pick something based on data in your DOM. So this is really quite useful if you have a list of data and you maybe want to pick a particular row based on their ID or their name or something like that, so that you can have a test that does the exact same action every time.
Yep.
Okay, you are out of time, so that should conclude our first episode.
Well, I was thinking let's quickly recap. I do have a couple minutes. We quickly recap what the answer, how we would answer this person. We don't usually type out the answer during the live stream because that would be boring. So I think what I would say to this person is something like, regardless of whether you're using Ember's built-in testing framework or you're using something else like Selenium, you have a number of different approaches that could work for you. And I would show, wrap the thing in a class. I would show add data test of your own. And then I would mention that for people who, at the very bottom, because other people are going to find this who aren't using Selenium, Selenium wasn't in their question originally, I would say if you're using Ember's built-in testing tools, add-ons such as Ember Basic Dropdown provide test selectors that make it easy for you to target and select options within this element so that, we don't send people down the difficult path if they're sticking straight to what the majority of Ember developers would be doing.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth mentioning, just in case somebody does stumble across this video, that the majority of Ember developers do not use Selenium for their tests because our testing system is, all automatically set up for you and really pretty awesome.
Yep. Cool.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Right, so that is it for today. I'm not sure exactly when next week we're going to have our next episode. What I was going to say is next week we will tweet about it. We'll try and give people a little bit more notice than we're live right now. Please come and join. But it was... it may kind of snuck up on me anyway with everything that's going on right now. So I hope everybody is staying safe and hope to see everybody next week.
Thanks so much for listening in.